The last guests were still walking toward their cars when 3 black SUVs rolled through the open farm gate. Marcus Reed stood beside the folding tables where neighbors had left half-empty casserole dishes after the funeral. He had loosened his tie, sleeves rolled to his forearms, when the first SUV stopped beside the old equipment shed. The doors opened almost in unison. Damian Reed stepped out first in a tailored charcoal suit, sunglasses still on despite the overcast Georgia afternoon. Behind him came his sister, Vanessa, scrolling through her phone, and Trevor, who paused long enough to look toward the farmhouse before following the others. A fourth vehicle, a silver sedan, pulled in behind them. A woman in a navy pantsuit climbed out carrying a leather portfolio. Marcus recognized no one until Damian spoke. "We need to handle this today." Marcus glanced toward the porch where church members were helping stack folding chairs. "Today's not the day." "It is now." Damian motioned toward the woman. "This is Linda Mercer. She's representing the estate." Attorney Mercer offered a polite nod before opening her portfolio. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Reed." Marcus returned the nod but didn't move closer. Mercer removed several stapled documents. A revised last will and testament was admitted for preliminary filing this morning. Your grandfather executed this document 6 months ago. Marcus frowned. 6 months? Damian folded his arms. "The property goes to us." Marcus looked from one cousin to the next, waiting for someone to smile, to admit the joke had gone too far. "Nobody did." Mercer continued in an even voice. "The farmland, residence, equipment, and associated acreage are divided among Mr. Damian Reed, Ms. Vanessa Reed, and Mr. Trevor Reed." Marcus remained still. "My name isn't on it." "No." The only sound for a moment came from cicadas, humming beyond the pecan trees. Marcus reached for the papers. Mercer handed them over without hesitation. He skimmed the first page, then another. His grandfather's signature looked familiar. The date did not. Before he could read further, another pickup truck entered through the gate. 2 men climbed out wearing shirts embroidered with the logo of a local moving company. Damian waved them toward the machine barn. "They'll start with the equipment." Marcus lowered the papers. "They're doing what?" "We've already scheduled transport." "The funeral ended 20 minutes ago." "And probate doesn't stop the calendar." Marcus stepped between the movers and the barn. "No one's touching anything." One of the movers looked toward Damian instead of arguing. Damian sighed. "You've had 7 years to play farmer." "I've been running the place." "You've been living here." Marcus looked at Trevor. Trevor shifted his weight but said nothing. Several neighbors had stopped loading their cars. Quiet conversations faded as people watched from across the yard. Mercer glanced toward Damian. "Until the court issues further instructions, I'd recommend documenting everything before removal." Damian's jaw tightened. "They're inventorying." Marcus looked back at the paperwork. Near the bottom of one page sat a notary seal. "Atlanta." He stared at it a second longer than the rest. His grandfather hated driving through Atlanta. The last time anyone had convinced him to go had been years earlier for a specialist appointment after his hip surgery. Marcus flipped another page. "Same city. Same office." He folded the packet closed. Damian mistook the silence for surrender. "I've already spoken with a developer. Surveyors come tomorrow morning. Closing won't take long after probate clears." Marcus finally looked him in the eye. "You've got buyers lined up already." "We move faster than you do." Marcus glanced across the yard toward the weathered farmhouse. His grandfather's brass tractor key still hung from the ring clipped to Marcus's belt, knocking softly against the buckle as he shifted. He rested one hand on it without thinking. Then he looked back at Attorney Mercer. "Can I keep these copies?" "Of course." He folded them neatly instead of crumpling them. "When do you expect me gone?" he asked. Damien answered before Mercer could. "The sun set." Marcus nodded once. No shouting. No threats. Just a long look across the fields where irrigation pivots stretched toward the tree line. Then he slipped the documents under his arm and started walking toward the farmhouse. Behind him, Damien called after the movers. "Tag every piece of equipment. We start first thing in the morning." Marcus didn't turn around. Inside the house, he placed the will on the kitchen table beside an old leather farm ledger worn smooth from decades of use. Only then did he pull out his phone. The first number he dialed wasn't family. It was the attorney who had helped his grandfather restructure the farm years earlier. The call went straight to voicemail. Marcus was already dressed in work clothes when the first truck rolled onto the gravel drive just after sunrise. A white pickup carrying 2 surveyors stopped near the gate. Behind it came the same moving truck from the afternoon before. Damien climbed out of his SUV with a coffee in one hand and his phone in the other, speaking to someone before ending the call. "They're here," he said as he slipped the phone into his pocket. Marcus closed the gate behind him. "No one's coming past this point." One of the surveyors looked between the two men. "We were hired to mark property lines." Marcus nodded. "I know, but there's still an ownership dispute." Damien laughed under his breath. "There isn't." Attorney Linda Mercer arrived a few minutes later, parking her sedan beside the barn instead of joining Damien's line of vehicles. She walked over carrying another folder. "I spoke with the probate clerk this morning," she said. "The court hasn't issued any possession order." Damien frowned. "The will is valid." "The will begins probate," Mercer replied. "It doesn't automatically transfer control of the property." The surveyors quietly returned to their truck. Marcus said nothing. Damien looked irritated, but waved the movers toward the equipment shed instead. "They can inventory." Marcus didn't argue with that. He simply followed. Inside the barn, workers photographed tractors, irrigation pumps, trailers, and shelving packed with spare parts. One man read serial numbers into a recorder while another attached temporary inventory tags. Marcus watched carefully. Whenever someone reached for a cabinet or toolbox, he stepped closer. "Photos only," he said. The movers looked toward Mercer. She nodded. "He's correct." Outside, Trevor wandered toward the pecan orchard. Marcus caught up with him between 2 rows of trees. Trevor shoved his hands into his pockets. "I didn't know Damien already had buyers." Marcus looked at him. "You didn't ask." "He said we'd figure everything out after the funeral." Marcus studied his cousin's face. "You believe Grandpa changed his mind?" Trevor didn't answer immediately. "He talked about this place all the time." "So?" "He never talked about selling it." Before Marcus could respond, Damien called Trevor back toward the house. The moment passed. By late morning, Marcus was driving toward the county courthouse in Macon. The probate office occupied the 2nd floor of the old government building. The clerk accepted the case number Marcus had copied from the will. "The filing came in yesterday morning," she said. Marcus nodded. "Can I see the supporting documents?" She handed him copies permitted under public record rules. Marcus compared dates. The execution date matched the will. The notary certificate matched. The witnesses had Atlanta addresses. He looked closer. One address belonged to an office building. Not a law office. A private mailbox center. Marcus thanked the clerk and walked downstairs. Instead of leaving, he crossed the street to the county tax assessor's office. The woman behind the counter searched the parcel number. "The tax bills have all been current." "I know." She turned the monitor slightly. "No ownership changes have been filed here since." She stopped. Marcus waited. 5 years ago. She frowned. That's odd. What is? Nothing. She caught herself. I can't discuss filings that aren't part of today's request. Marcus didn't press. He thanked her and walked back outside. The humid air felt heavier than before. His phone buzzed. Attorney Mercer. I've been reviewing medical records attached to the probate petition, she said. Marcus leaned against his truck. And your grandfather's physician listed mobility restrictions during the same month the will was supposedly signed. Marcus looked toward the courthouse steps. He wasn't traveling. I don't know that. But you noticed it. I noticed enough to start asking questions. Marcus looked across the parking lot at people coming and going for routine business, completely unaware that his family's future sat inside a few courthouse filing cabinets. I appreciate the call. I'm not taking sides, Mr. Reed. I didn't ask you to. After hanging up, Marcus opened the folded copy of the will again. Atlanta. Same notary. Same witnesses. His grandfather hadn't willingly driven into Atlanta traffic in nearly a decade. The details refused to fit. Before he could start the engine, another call came through. The display showed Damien. Marcus answered. What now? Damien didn't bother with greetings. The inventory's finished. Marcus waited. We're bringing flatbeds tomorrow. The line went dead. Marcus reached the farm just before noon. 2 flatbed trucks were already parked outside the machine barn. The drivers leaned against their cabs, while Damien argued with attorney Linda Mercer near the porch. I paid for today, Damien said. Mercer didn't raise her voice. And I told you there's still no court order authorizing removal. They're my assets. That's the issue we're trying to determine. Marcus walked past them without interrupting. Inside the barn, bright orange inventory tags still hung from tractors, seed drills, and irrigation pumps. Nothing had been moved. One of the drivers looked relieved. We're just waiting. Marcus nodded. You'll probably be waiting a while. He continued to the farmhouse. The leather farm ledger was exactly where he'd left it on the kitchen table. Beside it rested the brass tractor key his grandfather had carried long after the tractor itself had been retired. Marcus clipped the key back onto his belt before opening the ledger. The handwriting changed over the decades. Some pages were neat. Others looked hurried, written after long days in the fields. Crop rotations, rain totals, repair costs, notes about soil conditions. Between 2 yearly summaries, a folded receipt slipped onto the table. It was for lumber purchased 5 years earlier. Across the bottom, his grandfather had written one sentence in blue ink. Everything worth keeping has to be written down. Marcus folded the receipt back into place. His phone rang. The screen showed a Savannah number. Mr. Reed. Speaking. This is Daniel Holloway. Marcus straightened. His grandfather's business attorney. I've been in mediation all morning. I just heard your message. Marcus looked through the kitchen window toward the barn. I need copies of every filing you handled for Grandpa. There was a short pause. I expected this call eventually. You did. Your grandfather said there might come a day when someone questioned the farm. Marcus waited. I can't discuss confidential matters over the phone. I understand. But I can tell you this. Holloway's voice stayed calm. I'll be there tomorrow morning. The line disconnected. Marcus slipped the phone into his pocket. Outside, raised voices drifted across the yard. He stepped onto the porch. Damien stood beside a county deputy who had just arrived. The deputy removed his sunglasses. Afternoon. Marcus nodded. The deputy looked between both men. I got a call about property being withheld. Damien pointed toward the barn. He's blocking us from taking what's ours. The deputy turned to Marcus. You have paperwork showing ownership. I have reason to believe the estate paperwork is being challenged. Mercer answered before Marcus could continue. That's accurate. The deputy looked at her. So nobody's ignoring a court order. There isn't one. The deputy exhaled. Then this is civil. Damien looked frustrated. So that's it. Until a judge tells somebody to move, yes. The deputy tipped his hat toward Marcus before driving away. Silence settled over the yard for a moment. Trevor finally spoke. I found something. Everyone turned toward him. He held up his phone. I was looking through Grandpa's old photos. Damien frowned. So, this picture. Trevor walked over to Marcus instead of Damien. The image showed their grandfather standing beside the farmhouse calendar 6 months earlier. The same month printed on the will. The calendar included the date. More noticeable was the metal walker beside Grandpa. Trevor zoomed in. He could barely make it to the mailbox. Marcus studied the photograph. The timestamp matched. Atlanta was nearly 90 miles away. Damien dismissed it with a wave. Pictures don't prove anything. No, Mercer replied quietly. They don't. She kept looking at the screen anyway. Trevor lowered the phone. I just don't remember him leaving the county. Damien's patience snapped. You're really doing this now. I'm just saying what I remember. Marcus said nothing. He watched Mercer thinking instead. Her confidence from the funeral had changed. She wasn't defending the will anymore. She was measuring it. Late that afternoon, Damien climbed into his SUV. We'll finish this tomorrow. Marcus stood beside the gate as the vehicles pulled away one by one. Only Mercer remained long enough to lower her window. If Mr. Holloway is coming, she said, tell him to bring every recorded filing. Marcus looked at her. You already know there's something else. I know enough not to make assumptions. She drove away. As the dust settled across the driveway, Marcus looked toward the fields where the first irrigation system had started its slow afternoon rotation. The crops kept moving with the season. Whether the family did or not would be decided tomorrow. Daniel Holloway arrived just after 8 in the morning in a dusty gray sedan that looked older than most of the tractors parked behind the barn. He stepped out carrying 2 document boxes sealed with county archive tape. Marcus met him on the porch. Thank you for coming. Holloway nodded once. Your grandfather wanted these kept until they were needed. Before Marcus could answer, Damien's convoy rolled through the front gate. The flatbeds returned. So did the movers. Attorney Linda Mercer parked separately, as she had every day since the funeral. Damien climbed out wearing jeans and work boots instead of a suit. Glad everyone's finally here. Holloway looked toward him without expression. I assume you're Mr. Reed. The rightful heir. We'll see. Damien's smile disappeared. Everyone gathered around the weathered picnic table beside the farmhouse, where Holloway placed the first document box. He removed a thick binder, followed by certified copies of recorded deeds. Mercer stepped closer. So these were recorded with the county. They were. Holloway handed her the first document. She read silently for nearly a minute. Marcus watched her eyes move back to the top of the page before she turned to the attached filing stamp. This deed was recorded 5 years ago. Holloway nodded. Correct. Damien folded his arms. So what? Holloway looked directly at him. 5 years ago, your grandfather transferred ownership of the farmland, residence, equipment, and operating assets into Reed Agricultural Holdings, LLC. Damien laughed. Which Grandpa owned? No. Holloway slid another document across the table. Mr. Marcus Reed owned the controlling interest from the date of formation. The laughter stopped. Mercer reached for the operating agreement. She turned pages carefully. Manager, managing member, ownership percentages, recorded signatures, county filing numbers. Everything matched. She looked toward Marcus. You've been operating through the LLC this entire time. Marcus nodded. The farm stopped operating as personal property years ago. Damien grabbed one of the copies. This doesn't matter. It matters completely, Mercer replied. The land wasn't owned by your grandfather individually when he passed away. She placed the document back on the table, which means it isn't part of the probate estate. The words settled over the yard. Even the movers stopped pretending not to listen. Vanessa stepped forward. He still lived here. Holloway answered. He retained a lifetime occupancy agreement. He paid taxes. The company paid taxes. He called it his farm. It remained his home. Damien looked at Marcus. You planned this. Marcus shook his head. We plan to keep the farm operating. Damien turned toward Mercer. The will gives us everything. Mercer held up the certified deed. A will cannot distribute property someone no longer owns. Silence followed. One of the flatbed drivers quietly climbed back into his truck. The other did the same. Neither waited for instructions. Damien watched them leave. You can't just drive off. One driver leaned out his window. We haul equipment. He glanced toward Mercer. Not lawsuits. The trucks rolled through the gate and disappeared down the county road. Trevor stood motionless. I didn't know. Marcus believed him. Holloway opened the second archive box. There is one more matter. He removed copies of correspondence exchanged years earlier between himself and Marcus's grandfather. Mercer accepted them. Several letters discussed succession planning. Others documented meetings regarding the LLC formation. The dates stretched back months before the transfer. Nothing appeared rushed. Nothing suggested coercion. Everything had been methodical. Mercer closed the folder. I'll be filing amended notice with the probate court this afternoon. Damien stared at her. You're switching sides. I'm following the documents. She held up the disputed will. And now I have additional concerns. She pointed to the notarization. The execution location conflicts with your grandfather's documented condition. Then she looked at Holloway. These earlier filings also contradict several representations made in the probate petition. Holloway gave a small nod. I noticed the same issue. Marcus watched Damien for the first time since the funeral without seeing confidence. Only calculation. Vanessa quietly returned to her SUV. Trevor remained where he was, staring across the fields his grandfather had refused to sell. Mercer slipped the questioned will back into her briefcase, instead of returning it to Damien. I'll need the original, she said. For the court. No one answered. The morning breeze carried the smell of freshly turned soil from the neighboring field, as the farm settled back into its usual rhythm. For the first time since the funeral, the argument was no longer about who would leave by sunset. It was about who had brought a will into court that no longer made legal sense. The farm was quiet again by the following week. Only the sound of irrigation sprinklers and the steady rumble of a tractor carried across the pecan orchard. Marcus had nearly finished servicing a planter when a county sheriff's cruiser turned into the driveway. He shut off the engine and climbed down. The deputy who stepped out was the same one who had visited days earlier. This won't take long, he said. Marcus nodded. The deputy handed him a single-page report. The probate court acknowledged the amended filing this morning. The farm and business assets have been removed from the estate inventory. Marcus folded the paper once. Thank you. The court also requested additional review of the submitted will. Marcus looked toward the farmhouse. I heard. The deputy tipped his hat and drove away. No celebration followed. Marcus tucked the document into the leather farm ledger, waiting on the kitchen table. That afternoon, attorney Linda Mercer stopped by. She wasn't carrying a portfolio this time. Only a slim folder. I wanted to return these. She placed the original inventory photographs on the table. The movers won't be coming back. Marcus looked through the stack. Every machine remained exactly where it belonged. What happened? The development agreement was terminated. She closed the folder. The buyers learned the property wasn't part of the estate. Marcus nodded. I figured they would. There was no reason for them to continue. Mercer hesitated before speaking again. I've withdrawn from representing your cousins. Marcus looked up. Because of the will. Because I couldn't continue after the inconsistencies became impossible to explain. She didn't elaborate. Neither did Marcus. Professional decisions rarely needed commentary. Before leaving, Mercer paused on the porch. Your grandfather kept thorough records. He believed memory wasn't enough. She smiled faintly. It usually isn't. Trevor arrived the next morning in an aging pickup pulling a small utility trailer. Marcus recognized several fuel cans, toolboxes, and spare parts strapped inside. Items the movers had stacked near the barn before everything stopped. Trevor climbed out. I figured these belonged where they started. Marcus helped unload without asking questions. When they finished, Trevor brushed the dust from his hands. I should have asked more questions. Marcus closed the trailer gate. You finally did. Trevor nodded once. There wasn't much else to say. He drove away a few minutes later. News traveled faster than either of them expected. Neighbors stopping by for seed deliveries or equipment parts all seemed to know some version of what had happened. Marcus answered every question the same way. The paperwork caught up. Nothing more. Late that afternoon, another vehicle rolled slowly toward the gate. Damien. This time he came alone. No SUVs. No movers. No attorney. He remained beside his vehicle instead of walking onto the property. The sale's dead, he said. Marcus waited. The investors backed out. Neither man mentioned the loans Damien had counted on paying off. Neither mentioned the probate review still hanging over the disputed will. Those problems no longer belonged to the farm. Damien looked across the fields. I thought Grandpa would have wanted all of us to benefit. Marcus rested one hand on the old brass tractor key clipped to his belt. He wanted the farm to survive. For the first time since the funeral, Damien didn't argue. He climbed back into his SUV and drove away without another word. Marcus watched until the dust settled behind him. Then he turned toward the equipment shed. The following morning began before sunrise. Marcus opened the leather farm ledger on the kitchen table. The last completed entry belonged to his grandfather. Months earlier, Marcus uncapped a pen. He recorded the date, weather conditions, soil moisture, the acreage scheduled for planting. Nothing dramatic, just another season beginning. He closed the ledger and slipped it onto the shelf where it had always been kept. Outside, the eastern sky had started to brighten. Marcus climbed onto the tractor. The old brass key tapped lightly against his belt as the engine came to life. Rows that had been in the Reed family for generations stretched ahead, waiting for another planting. The argument over ownership was over. The work never had been.